Hey everyone, once again welcome back to SJ's classes. It's been a while since we started learning together. It is your paper Literary Criticism that we had been discussing so far. We completed the first three modules. The first module was about classical criticism. We focused on Plato, Aristotle, Longinus, and Horace in that particular episode. The second module was titled Medieval and Renaissance Criticism. It's only Philip Sidney that we came across in that particular module. Then we came to English neoclassical criticism. We had three critics to focus. The first was John Dryden, the second Alexander Pope, and finally Dr. Samuel Johnson. Now it's time to move on to the fourth module. The fourth module is Romantic and Victorian Criticism. And the very first literary critic that we have to confront as part of this module is William Wordsworth. I'm sure you have heard this name before. You might have known him more as a poet than a literary critic. In this video lesson, we will be looking at William Wordsworth as a literary critic. But like always, I would like to give you a short introduction to this writer. He is popular as a poet, but he has also written literary works. You might have learned this poetic figure in connection with the movement Romanticism. He, along with Coleridge, inaugurated Romantic movement in English literature, and it happened in 1798 with the publication of lyrical ballads. Let us look at some of the important points regarding William Wordsworth's biography. William Wordsworth was one of the founders of English Romanticism. You have proto-romantics or pre-romantics like Thomas Gray, Robert Burns. But the movement Romanticism began with William Wordsworth. And as I said earlier, it began with the publication of lyrical ballads in 1798. It was jointly published by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He is remembered as a poet concerned with the human relationship with nature and a fierce advocate of using the vocabulary and speech patterns of common people in poetry. This is what his criticism also stands for: using common language, using everyday speech, using the language of prose in poetry. He was born on April 7, 1770 in the Lake District of England, and he died on April 23, 1850. Wordsworth is best known for lyrical ballads co-written with Samuel Taylor Coleridge and The Prelude, a romantic poem chronicling the growth of a poet's mind. Some of his other popular poems are Intimations of Immortality, The Excursion, and the Ecclesiastical Sketches. You might have definitely come across his poem Daffodils. I'm not speaking about such poems which are popular globally. His poems which have attained or invited critical attentions are the ones which I mentioned earlier. He has also written prose works. Some of them are Literary Criticism, which came out in 1966, Letters of Dorothy and William Wordsworth, which came out in 1967, and Prose Works, which came out in 1974. It's also important to understand the shift from the neoclassical age to Romantic movement. Why this shift happened? What was actually Romantic movement? The neoclassically oriented writers of the Augustan age, the age which preceded Romantic age, which consisted of popular writers like Swift, Addison and Steele, Pope, Richardson and Fielding, they chose to imitate classical authors of Greek and Rome. They admired Virgil and Horace for correctness of phrase and polished urbanity and grace. Reason indeed was the prime source of inspiration. Emotion had to be subordinated to thought. This is what Romantic writers revolted against. The age, the writers who preceded Romantic writers, they gave more importance to reason and rationale, and emotion was subordinated. Later, in poetry, a break with this traditionalism began. The so-called proto-romantics or transition poets like Cowper, Gray, Blake and Burns refused to merely copy classical subjects and forms. They wrote instead about simple natural things in plain language, though they retained many of the older poetic structures. Many of the short poems that Wordsworth and Coleridge wrote were aimed at breaking the decorum of neoclassical verse. These poems appeared in 1798 in a slim, anonymously authored volume entitled Lyrical Ballads, which opened with Coleridge's famous poem The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and closed with Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey. Now, as we are into our fifth semester and as we are discussing literary criticism, it's lyrical ballads that we need to focus on as far as William Wordsworth is concerned. Next, let us look at William Wordsworth as a literary critic. The literary theory of Wordsworth came to be written between the years 1798 and 1815. During these 7 years, Wordsworth wrote the preface to Lyrical Ballads. It actually came out as 2 installments, the first one in 1800 and the second one in 1802. The 3-part essay, which was titled Essay upon Epitaphs, which came out in 1810, and the prefaces to The Excursion and the Poems, which came out in 1814 and 1815 respectively. So these are some of his contributions towards the realm of English literary criticism. The literary criticism of Wordsworth is the manifesto of the British Romantic movement. It means that he inculcated into it the spirit of the Romantic movement. It effects a formal break with the neoclassical tradition. He rejected the diction of the 18th century poetry and favored the use of language of prose in poetry. The preface to Lyrical Ballads is the vital essay among all these works. It has always been regarded as the most authentic expression of the ideals of Romantic movement in English poetry. The first version of 1800 had 7,000 words. The 1802 version had another 3,000 words to it. An appendix of 2,000 words was again added to the 1802 edition. The preface is a statement of Wordsworth's poetic vision and offers an explanation of the poetic process behind the poems. So these are some of the introductory remarks on Lyrical Ballads. Now let us look at the work in detail. What Wordsworth does is he gives poets certain ideas on how to compose poetry. As I stated earlier, he wanted poets to retain common speech in poetry. He wanted both prose and poetry to have the same language. Now you have to understand that this idea was contested later on. His great friend Coleridge itself contested this idea. He refuted against this argument of Wordsworth that you need to retain common speech in poetry. And when you come across Wordsworth's poetry, you also find that he hasn't followed these ideas in his poetry. He hasn't followed the language of prose in poetry. So his ideas stands in contrast. His ideas stand in contrast to his own poems as well as the critics who came later. Wordsworth pleads for the retention of common speech in poetry. We see Wordsworth in his preface to Lyrical Ballads speak as a representative man speaking to his fellow men. He says that the principal object was to choose incidents and situations from common life. And this is also the idea behind composing Lyrical Ballads. You must remember this is the preface to Lyrical Ballads. So he has also given certain ideas, certain explanations as far as the poems in Lyrical Ballads are concerned. So the principal object behind writing lyrical ballads was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them in a selection of language really used by men. That means common language used by common men, and at the same time to throw over them a certain coloring of imagination. So you have to use the language used by common men, ordinary people. You also have to add a tinge of imagination to it. That is where the romantic movement comes in, because the romantic writers gave a lot of importance to imagination, and the combination or the amalgamation of this ordinary language with imagination would make ordinary things seem in an unusual manner. So to make ordinary things seem extraordinary, to make the usual seem extra or unusual, that is what the motive was behind writing lyrical ballads. If that was Wordsworth's idea, Coleridge had a different motive. He wanted to make the unusual things seem usual, and that is why he wrote even the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Wordsworth wishes that poetry should concern itself with the essential passions of the heart. So this is an advice given by Wordsworth to his fellow writers as well as poets. To do this, the characters must be people in rural areas occupied in rural work, because the passions of these persons are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. These men constantly communicate with the best objects in the world of nature, from which the best part of the language is originally derived. So his wish is that poetry should concern itself with essential passions of the heart. And to do this, you have to select characters from the rural background, the countryside, because they constantly communicate with the best objects in the world, to be specific, with in nature. So as you know, romantics gave a lot of importance to nature. Return to nature was the very maxim that they followed. So to focus on countryside and the people living there who are engaged in rural businesses, that is what you need to focus upon, and that those are the characters whom you need to incorporate into your poems. And it's also in lyrical ballads that, or the preface, that the famous definition to poetry comes. William Wordsworth says that good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Poetry is not a matter of rules and regulations. The poet is an uncommon man, gifted in many ways and in some sense superior to the common folk. Poetry is not just an intellectual activity. For him, it is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. So there you have the definition of poetry given by Wordsworth. Spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. Language of good poetry must not differ from that of good prose. This is his idea regarding diction or language of poetry is concerned. Language of good poetry must be the same as the language of good prose. He dismissed elevated vocabulary, personification, pathetic fallacy. Now these are some of the ideas that he disregarded while attempting poetry, or his advice for poets that you should stay away from these ideas. Elevated vocabulary, personification, pathetic fallacy. Pathetic fallacy is nothing but attributing human feelings to inanimate objects. He also abstained from using periphrases. Periphrases means indirect ways of expressing things. And also inversions, the reversal of the ordinary. That is what inversion means. He also asked poets to stay away from antithesis, means phrase that means the exact opposite. He also suggested to use classical mythology, or rather he dismissed the use of classical mythology, conceits which the metaphysical poets used a lot. Hyperbole means exaggeration, and obscurity means lack of clarity. So these are some of the things that you need to abstain yourself when you write poetry. Now he also resisted the belief that poetry was only to teach moral lessons. It had an aesthetic beauty. It can also be written for entertainment, for pleasure, for conveying feelings and emotions. So All these ideas are being conveyed by Wordsworth through his preface to Lyrical Ballads. So these are some of the important points that your textbook focuses on as far as Wordsworth is concerned. It is the preface to Lyrical Ballads that we learn as part of your syllabus. I hope you have an understanding regarding Wordsworth the Critic, some of his important contributions towards literary criticism, and specifically preface to Lyrical Ballads. Thank you so much for watching. In the next video lesson, I will discuss the next romantic critic, which is Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Thank you.